Good evening and welcome to the March 16th, 2021 Findlay City Council meeting, regular session. We'll start with the roll call.
Mr. Greeno.
Present.
Mr. Haas.
Here.
Mr. Hellman.
Here.
Mr. Niemeyer.
Here.
Mr. Palmer.
Present.
Mr. Russell.
Here.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Here.
Mr. Slough.
Here.
Ms. Warnicki. Here. And Mr. Wobser.
Present.
Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I will entertain a motion to accept the previous city council meeting minutes. Mr. Slough.
I have moved to accept the minutes of the last council meeting as circulated.
Second, Mr. Greeno. Any discussion? The one quick note that you should have received from our clerk today, there was an amendment to a section, so they will be accepted as amended. Any other discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? The minutes are accepted. Mr. Russell, do we have any add-on replacements or removals from tonight's agenda?
We do not.
We also do not have any proclamations, recognition, or retirement resolutions. We have no oral communications. We do have one petition.
An alley vacation request for Bliss Avenue from Chris Ostrander to vacate a portion of Bliss Avenue at 1501 Lima Avenue in the Thorpe and Andrew addition.
Any questions, comments, or discussion? Hearing none, that will be referred to City Planning Commission and the Planning and Zoning Committee. We have no written communications. Reports of municipal officers and departments.
Legal opinion 2021-01 on 735.05 contracts, materials, and labor from Law Director Rasmussen.
Any questions or comments or discussion? Hearing none. Opinion to be filed.
City Income Tax Monthly Collections Report for February 2021.
Questions or comments? Report to be filed.
Findlay Police Departmental Activities Report for February 2021.
Questions or comments? Report to be filed.
Findlay Fire Department Activities Report for February 2021.
Questions or comments? Report to be filed.
Financial Summary Report as of February 28th, 2021.
Questions or comments? Report to be filed.
Findlay Municipal Court Activities Report for February 2021.
Questions or comments? Report to be filed.
Letter from City Engineer Thomas regarding Blue Bonnet and Bittersweet Sanitary Sewers, project number 356-01200.
Questions or comments? Letter to be filed.
Letter from City Engineer Thomas regarding 2021 annual street resurfacing curb repairs, Contract A, concrete, project number 328-10900.
Questions or comments? Letter to be filed.
Treasurer's Reconciliation Report for February 28th, 2021.
Questions or comments? Report to be filed.
Financial Summary for Mayor Mern.
Questions or comments? Summary to be filed.
City Engineer Thomas regarding North Side Sewer Televising, project number 356-03400.
Questions or comments? Mr. Russell.
Yeah, Brian, how much are we looking to get done? Can you put this in scope of our annual discussion on televising, and where are we with getting the whole city done, and what's our scope this year?
Yes and no. This is not actually our annual one that we have. We've got an area of town that we're told has high inflow and infiltration. So the first step is we're taking our CDBG money from this year starting by televising it to look if the sewers need repaired, lined, whatever. And then once we get that done, get those videos looked at, then we'll be going through putting together something to line the ones that need lined and do this and do that. This area in particular is bound by Trenton on the south, Melrose on the north, Broad on the west, and it goes over to, I think it's Bolton on the east. So we're going to be looking at all the sewers in that area.
And so you determine that you have the issue, what tells you that you have the issue that we need to investigate?
Well, actually, we're updating our long-term control plan with EPA, and the consultant went through and updated the sewer models. And that's one area of town that they said, hey, this area needs looked at some point in time. And we had our CDBG money in there. So I thought, since this is an area where I can use it, since I can't use it everywhere, let's start with that and go from there. So I'll be, when we go to bid the actual 2021 televising, I'll make sure I'll get you the number of feet and tell you where we're at.
That's great, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, letter to be filed.
A letter from City Engineer Thomas regarding East Street and East Main Cross water line at intersection, project number 357-11300.
Questions or comments? Letter to be filed.
A letter from City Engineer Thomas regarding on Greenway Trail Phase 2, project number 31993-800.
Questions or comments? Mr. Russell.
So Brian, in your letter, or in an email, you had mentioned that there's a risk to the schedule. What's the risk to the schedule if this isn't passed tonight? Are we anywhere close to to a point where this might move to the next following year for construction?
It may not get pushed to another year for construction, but it would be a lot more difficult to hit it so that it wouldn't. Once we get the funds around, I got to get, the consultant's got to get somebody lined up to go out and do it. All of that takes time. There are 5 Tuesdays in March. We are still in March, right? So the next council meeting's not for another 3 weeks. I was going to wait, but in that 3 weeks' time, that kind of puts the consultant in a bind. It could result in, additional design fees, if they have to work overtime to get it done to hit the current schedule.
So would you like that to be emergency legislation?
I would appreciate it if council would consider that. I'm not going to tell council they have to do that because that's your decision.
For emergency legislation. Thank you,
Mr.
sir.
Slav, please use your mic. Thank you.
I had it on, but
Any other questions or comments?
What's the timeline on this project? We're design this year, potential construction summer of 2022?
Actual construction is not till ODOT fiscal year 24, which starts July of 23. The issue with this is this runs out by the Blanchard River, so there's a whole extra string of environmental clearances that we have to get done that take more time than normal. So they were estimating a year just to get all the environmental work done. So it sounds like, well, you got till July of 23, that's 2 years. But to keep stuff moving, I really don't, because I got to get the plans done so that they know where we're going to be putting stuff so that they can get the clearances done.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions? Hearing none, letter to be filed.
Letter from City Engineer Thomas regarding Chapel Drive Storm Sewer Project number 355-00500.
Questions or comments? Letter to be filed.
Letter from Mayor Mern regarding Miracle League donation.
Questions or comments? Letter to be filed. Committee reports.
The Strategic Planning Committee met on March 2nd, 2021 to discuss the finalization of an RFQ for a contractor to assist with the initial data gathering for the strategic plan. We recommend the committee change the proposal to an RFQ instead of an RFP. Also recommend that Baker Tilly review the RFQ prior to publication.
Mr. Russell.
Move for adoption of the committee report.
Second, Mr. Hellman. Discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the committee report say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Committee report is adopted. Legislation, we will start with a resolution.
First reading for Resolution 8, 2021. A resolution recognizing the support of the City of Findlay, Ohio for the flood mitigation efforts within the Findlay, Hancock County, Ohio community.
Questions or, I'm sorry, Mr. Russell.
Move for adoption of resolution 008-2021.
Second, Mr. Slough. Discussion. Hearing none. All those in favor of resolution 008-2021, say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
Mr. Haas.
Aye.
Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Aye.
Mr. Slough.
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki.
Aye.
And Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
The resolution is adopted. Ordinances.
Third reading for ordinance 2021-16 as amended. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service of the City of Findlay, Ohio to take bids and enter into contracts for insurance coverage for airport liability, automobile, boiler machinery, contractors' equipment, crime insurance, police professional liability, public officials' errors and omissions liability, real and personal property, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Slough.
I would move for adoption of ordinance 2021-016 as amended.
Second, Mr. Schindeldecker. Discussion. Hearing none. All those in favor of ordinance 2021-016, say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Haas.
Aye.
Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Aye.
Mr. Slough.
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki.
Aye.
Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
And Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
Third reading for ordinance 2021-17. An ordinance amending chapter 1100 et sec of the codified ordinances of the City of Findlay, Ohio, known as the zoning code, by rezoning the following described property, referred to as 610 South Blanchard Street rezone, which previously was zoned C1 Local Commercial District, to R4 Duplex Triplex.
Mr. Hellman.
I move that we approve ordinance 2021-017.
Second, Mr. Slough. Discussion. Hearing none. All those in favor of ordinance 2021-017, say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Aye.
Mr. Slough.
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki.
Aye.
Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
And Mr. Haas.
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
Second reading for ordinance 2021-19, an ordinance to approve certain replacement pages to the Findlay codified ordinances and declaring an emergency.
Okay, next.
Second reading for ordinance 2021-21, an ordinance appropriating and transferring funds and declaring an emergency.
Okay, next.
Second reading for ordinance 2021-22, an ordinance authorizing the service director and the safety director of the City of Findlay, Ohio, to advertise for bids where required and enter into a contract or contracts for construction of various projects in accordance with the 2021 department equipment list, appropriating and transferring funds for said capital expenditures and declaring an emergency.
Okay, next.
First reading for ordinance 2021-25, an ordinance appropriating and transferring funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Wobser.
I'd like to make a motion that council's rules be suspended and this legislation be given its second and third reading.
Second, Mr. Greeno. All those in favor of suspending the rules, say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Aye.
Mr. Slough.
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki.
Aye.
Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
Mr. Haas.
Aye.
And Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
The rules of council have been suspended, and the clerk will give this its second and third reading.
Ordinance 2021-25, ordinance 2021-25.
Mr. Wobson.
Motion to approve.
Second, Mr. Slough. Discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor of ordinance 2021-025, say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Aye.
Mr. Slough.
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki.
Aye.
Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
Mr. Haas.
Aye.
Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
And Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
First reading for ordinance 2021-26, an ordinance appropriating and transferring funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Russell.
Move that council statutory rules be suspended and ordinance 2021-026 be given its second and third reading.
Second, Mr. Greeno. All those in favor of suspending the rules say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Schindledecker?
Aye.
Mr. Slough?
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer?
Aye.
And Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
The rules of council have been suspended. The clerk will give us its second and third reading.
Ordinance 2021-26, ordinance 2021-26.
Mr. Wobser.
Motion to approve.
Second, Mr. Haas. Discussion. Hearing none. All those in favor of ordinance 2021-026 say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Schindledecker?
Aye.
Mr. Slough?
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer?
Aye.
Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
And Mr. Russell?
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
First reading for ordinance 2021-27, an ordinance appropriating and transferring funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Greeno.
I move the statutory rules of council be waived and we give this its second and third reading, please.
Second, Mr. Slough. All those in favor of suspending the rules say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Slough?
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer?
Aye.
Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Schindledecker?
Aye.
The rules of council have been suspended, and the clerk will give the ordinance its second and third reading.
Ordinance 2021-27, ordinance 2021-27.
Mr. Greeno.
Move for adoption of ordinance number 2021-027.
Second, Mr. Slough. Discussion. Hearing none. All those in favor of ordinance 2021-027 say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer?
Aye.
Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Schindledecker?
Aye.
Mr. Slough?
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
First reading for ordinance 2021-28, an ordinance appropriating and transferring funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Wobser.
Brian, on this project, you mentioned that there's some economies of scale here with some work that's being done by the water department in the same area.
It's not the economy of scale, it's the
Time
existing.
economy of scale.
The water line's actually running through an existing manhole. The manhole is located right in the dead center of the intersection of Main Cross, Martin Luther King, and East Street.
Excellent.
We actually found it a couple years ago, but since we knew the Martin Luther King project was going to go on, instead of closing down the intersection for a couple days to do the work, I asked them if they could wait until we knew the project was going on, and then when the contractor for that project has it closed, we can get in there and do the work also. So it's really so that we don't have to close the intersection multiple times and inconvenience the drivers.
Okay, so we're ready. The timelines have all come together, and we
The
can do it.
timelines are all good. I just need the money so I can get the parts ordered.
Understood. With that in mind, I'd like to make a motion that council rules be suspended and 2021-28 be given its second and third reading.
Second, Mr. Palmer. All those in favor of suspending the rules say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer?
Aye.
Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Schindledecker?
Aye.
Mr. Slough?
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
The rules of council have been suspended. The clerk will give the ordinance its second and third reading.
Ordinance 2021-28, ordinance 2021-28.
Mr. Greeno.
Move for approval of the ordinance.
Second, Mr. Russell. Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor of the ordinance say aye. After your name is called, those opposed, nay.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer?
Aye.
Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Schindledecker?
Aye.
Mr. Slough?
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
And Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
First reading for ordinance 2021-29, An ordinance appropriating and transferring funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Russell.
Move that council statutory rules be suspended and ordinance 2021-029 be given its second and third reading.
Second, Mr. Hellman. All those in favor of suspending the rules, say aye. If your name is called, those opposed, nay.
Mr. Haas.
Aye.
Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Aye.
Mr. Slough.
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki. Aye. Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
The rules have been suspended, and the clerk will give the ordinance its second and third reading.
Ordinance 2021-29. Ordinance 2021-29.
Mr. Wobser.
Make a motion to adopt 2021-29.
Second, Mr. Hellman. Discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor of ordinance 2021-029, say aye. If your name is called, those opposed, nay.
Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Aye.
Mr. Slough.
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki. Aye. Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
And Mr. Haas.
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
First reading for ordinance 2021-30, an ordinance appropriating and transferring funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Greeno.
Move the statutory rule of council be waived and this ordinance be given its second, third reading.
Second, Mr. Wobser. All those in favor of suspending the rules, say aye. If your name is called, those opposed, nay.
Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Aye.
Mr. Slough.
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki. Aye. Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
Mr. Haas.
Aye.
And Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
The rules of council have been suspended. The clerk will give the ordinance its second and third reading.
Ordinance 2021-30, ordinance 2021-30.
Mr. Greeno.
Move for adoption of ordinance 2021-030.
Second, Mr. Wobser. Discussion or questions? Mr. Wobser.
Brian, on this one, I think as much as we're suspending rules tonight, it's good to give it a reason for this. And you've got a contractor lined up that's ready to go, is that correct?
He would actually like to get started before the next meeting if that's possible. I don't know if I can actually get contracts around and get them all signed by then, but I'm gonna try my best. If he actually had his way, he would have it done before the next council meeting, but that's not gonna happen because the asphalt plants aren't gonna be open, so. Yeah, he's looking at starting the week of the next council meeting, so.
Very good.
If you're willing to suspend it, then we can make sure they can get started, get in and out probably within a week, and then that block will be done and we won't have any further disturbance to the property owners.
Very good, thank you.
Mr. Russell.
Brian, are you finding that contractors are pretty eager to get started and get to work this year? Or is that abnormal, or is it per normal, or is it COVID related with the eagerness?
Right now, the contractors, yes, we're looking for work. For example, this job is, and I don't have my letter in front of me, it was under $100,000, I believe. And we had, the number of bidders we had, it honestly surprised me for something of that size. I know there were contractors that thought they had jobs last year, that the jobs got canceled because, other municipalities didn't have the money. So I think we're getting good bids because we bid it. A lot of them would like to get in. I don't like asking you to suspend this many, or if you would consider it, but especially on the bigger ones. But the concrete contractor to do the curbs, he wants to get started in the middle of April if he can. He's hoping to be done by June. As soon as he gets done, we can get the asphalt guy in. The sooner we get him in, the sooner we get done. And that always leaves room, for weather days to come in. So, yeah, this year they're looking for work. They're getting good pricing. Now, some pricing is starting to go up. The price of asphalt is starting to go up. The price of steel is starting to go up. But that's, stuff that we don't have any control over.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Hearing none, all those in favor of ordinance 2021-030, say aye. If your name is called, those opposed, nay.
Mr. Palmer.
Aye.
Mr. Russell.
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker.
Aye.
Mr. Slough.
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki. Aye. Mr. Wobser.
Aye.
Mr. Greeno.
Aye.
Mr. Haas.
Aye.
Mr. Hellman.
Aye.
And Mr. Niemeyer.
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted.
First reading for ordinance 2021-31, an ordinance appropriating funds and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Russell.
Move that council's statutory rules be suspended and ordinance 2021-031 be given its second and third reading.
Second, Mr. Hellman. All those in favor of suspending the rules say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
Mr. Schindeldecker?
Aye.
Mr. Slough?
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer?
Aye.
Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
The rules of council have been suspended, and the clerk will give the ordinance its second and third reading.
Ordinance 2021-31, ordinance 2021-31.
Mr. Russell.
Move for adoption of ordinance 2021-031.
Second, Mr. Greeno. Discussion. Mr. Russell.
This is a transfer of a donation given to us by the Miracle League of Findlay for the addition of some bleachers and some shade structures out at the Miracle League Park. What a fabulous facility, and one that really has been an unqualified success. And to see them privately generate the money to continue the physical improvements out there is very much appreciated. I tip my hat to Brad Kohler and all of his team and committee that make this happen. And I just thank them very much for their continued passion for the Miracle League.
Any other discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of the ordinance 2021-031 say aye if your name is called. Those opposed, nay.
Mr. Schindeldecker?
Aye.
Mr. Slough?
Aye.
Ms. Warnicki?
Aye.
Mr. Wobser?
Aye.
Mr. Greeno?
Aye.
Mr. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Hellman?
Aye.
Mr. Niemeyer?
Aye.
Mr. Palmer?
Aye.
Mr. Russell?
Aye.
The ordinance is adopted. Old business. New business. Mr. Wobser.
I'd like to call a strategic planning committee meeting for April 6th at 5:30 p.m. here in council chambers. The reason for this meeting will be to conclude the RFP. Thank you. After all that, I still messed it up. Thank you. RFQ. Thank you, Dennis. And to finalize that document and take into account the feedback that we should have by Baker Tilly at that point in time.
Any other new business? Mr. Russell.
Two items. I'm going to call a planning and zoning meeting for April 8th at noon. So that is that'll be after our next council meeting, but that's Thursday, April 8th at noon. We'll be over here in the council office. Just a second item. My wife and I were two of the attendees at the vaccination clinic run by Hancock Public Health, the hospital, and University of Findlay on Saturday at the Kaler Center. And I spent probably a grand total of 25 minutes at this vaccination clinic, including 15 minutes of sitting in a chair until I could leave, which means that this thing ran like clockwork. It was a very impressive arrangement set up. We literally walked right through, got a shot, sat down, and then walked out. I tip my hat to all three organizations for their efforts in putting this together. I'm already scheduled. We get follow-up shots in April, and those are already scheduled. I understand there's another clinic coming up, or a vaccination clinic coming up in a couple of days or weeks, and I'm sure the mayor will have a specific date. But if you have the opportunity, you shouldn't. Don't say no because you're worried it's going to be a convoluted mess. It was anything but. It was just so well run. So I tip my hat to those organizations.
Ms. Mayor.
Just a couple of quick items. First of all, I certainly appreciate Councilman Russell's comments regarding the vaccine clinic. We had 2,000 vaccines that were distributed on Saturday, and certainly it was the clockwork, and that occurs because of thorough planning, walkthroughs, and coordination between our different departments, and we are certainly fortunate again that our community works so well together. As Councilman Russell mentioned, our next mass vaccination vaccination clinic is scheduled for the 22nd, so a week from yesterday. We are starting to see an increase in the number of vaccines that we have available in our community, which is great, especially with the news. If you haven't seen it, the governor announced that on the 19th, so I believe that's Thursday, I've lost all track of dates. But later this week, 40 years and older are eligible to receive the vaccine, as well as a number of different health conditions. And then March 26th, anyone 16 years and older will be eligible for the vaccine in the state of Ohio, and I cannot wait to sign up to get my vaccine. So that will be great to continue to see that become available within our community and continue to push those vaccines out. So we're very fortunate that Hancock Public Health, the Blanchard Valley, the health system, a number of students, over 150 volunteers throughout the day made that happen, and our firefighters even took their shifts just sitting and observing, ready to run out into the community if the call so arose, but they were able to, instead of sitting at the firehouse, to be able to sit and observe and help out with that effort. So great to see that happen. Wanted to just mention, hopefully you saw the email regarding the American Rescue Plan dollars that the city of Findlay will be receiving. We'll be receiving right around $4 million this year and about $4 million next year. We have not yet received the Treasury guidance on how those can be utilized, so we have some general ideas, but we are waiting to receive that guidance, and then the administration will work with the auditor to kind of get some ideas on how we would like to recommend those dollars be spent and what's eligible expenses, and then we'll certainly work with you all to determine kind of what our next steps are from there. I know our department heads are already brainstorming some ideas on how we can make sure that those dollars are being best utilized within our community. I wanted to give a shout out real quick to the engineering department. As you can see from your agenda today, they have been hard at work. It takes a lot of coordination to coordinate getting these projects out the door, street closures, communication, all of those different items. We're certainly not perfect, but they do a fantastic job and get a lot of work done with a small team of folks, and I just wanted to give them a shout out because they do a fantastic job in making sure our infrastructure in Hancock County is not only maintained at an exceptionally high level, but at the lowest cost possible. And that does not happen by accident. That happens by a lot of hard work and strategy, and certainly your support. So thank you for supporting them, but thank you to Brian and his team for making sure that happens. And then finally, I just want to mention that it has been obviously a crazy year. It's hard to believe that we have been dealing with the pandemic for a year, but I just wanted to say thank you, because as a community, we are far and above positioned better than any other community, both from a resource perspective, from a getting the vaccine rolled out, and from the overall management of the COVID pandemic. And I appreciate your support in trusting the administration and myself to be able to serve our community and keep us moving forward, keep us focused on what we need to do to serve our community each and every day, but also make sure that we are positioned to move forward. So I just wanted to say thank you, because it's been an interesting year for sure, but I'm really excited for what the future holds, because we're in a great spot, and that comes largely because you guys have been supportive and made sure that our community is positioned well. So thank you. Any questions for me?
Mr. Slav.
I just want to know how the safety service position recruiting is going.
Yeah, so as you may have seen in the newspaper, we have 2 final candidates that will be coming in next week for interviews. That will be meeting with all of the department heads and in a number of our departments, and then I would expect to make a decision late next week, and I will let you guys know as soon as that decision has been made.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so great candidates. Any other questions? Thank you.
Any other new business? Hearing none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Mr. Slough, second Mr. Palmer. All those in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? We are adjourned. Quick as ever.
Well, we got through a lot of legislation.